Good afternoon. I'm David Ferrier, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater this afternoon here at the National Archives. And a special welcome to those who are joining us on our YouTube station. Before we begin today's talk, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up this week in the McGowan Theater. On Wednesday, June 3rd at noon, author and beer scholar Garrett Peck will introduce us to the history of brewing in Washington, D.C. The city's brewing history began in 1796, and after a 55-year dry spell, has revived in recent years. After his talk, he'll sign copies of his book, Capital Beer, and before or after the program, I hope you'll take an opportunity to visit our exhibit upstairs, Spirited Republic, Alcohol in American History. And on Friday, June 5th at noon, we welcome back historian H.W. Brands to tell us about his new biography, Reagan, A Life, and a book signing will follow that program also. To learn more about these and all of our programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online, and there are copies in the lobby as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it by regular mail or email. You'll also find brochures about other archives, programs, and activities. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. Last December, President Obama announced that his administration would begin efforts to reestablish diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba and increase travel and commerce between the two nations. The President called these actions the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years. Just 2 months earlier, Back Channel to Cuba was published. Who could ask for better timing? The two authors with us today spent years examining secret communications between the two countries across decades of public hostility. Their work has won praise from many quarters. Reviewing the book for Foreign Affairs, Professor Richard Feinberg declared that this exhaustive and masterful diplomatic history will stand as the most authoritative account of U.S.-Cuban diplomatic relations during the 5 decades of Cuban President Fidel Castro's rule. And Enrique Krauss of the New York Review of Books called it an impressive investigation that reads like a fascinating and thorough intellectual introduction to the Accords, and said the history of attempts to reach an agreement read like a James Bond novel. To tell us more about these goings-on during the half-century of diplomatic intrigue, we have LeoGrande and Peter Kornbluh. Professor LeGrande is a professor of government and dean emeritus of the School of Public Affairs at American University here in Washington. He's written widely on Latin America and U.S. Latin American relations, with special attention to Cuba and Central America. He's the author of Our Own Backyard, The United States in Central America, 1977 to 1992, and co-author of Back Channel to Cuba. He's also co-editor of a contemporary Cuba reader. I'm from Boston, so Cuba and reader it's a difficult combination of words. The Revolution under Raul Castro. His articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Miami Herald, and other newspapers and journals. Peter Kornbluh is a senior analyst with the National Security Archive, where he directs its Cuba and Chile documentation projects. He was co-director of the Iran-Contra documentation project and director of the Archives project on U.S. policy toward Nicaragua. From 1990 to 1999, he taught at Columbia University as an adjunct assistant professor of international and public affairs. In addition to Back Channel to Cuba, Peter has written a number of books. Among these are The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, and The Pinochet File, a declassified dossier on atrocity and accountability. His articles have been published in Foreign Policy, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, and The Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, and many other newspapers and journals. He's also appeared on numerous national television and radio broadcasts. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome William LeoGrande and Peter Kornbluh.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to to be here at the National Archives and with the Chief Archivist of the United States of America. This is a wonderful system which has so many manifestations. You're here in this beautiful building. We have spent 10 years in the presidential libraries and the National Archives out at College Park asking for documents, getting documents, reviewing the documents, and putting them into this book. And it's such a wonderful kind of closure for us as researchers and writers to be here to share the material with you that we were able to find in this archival system that our U.S. government has put together. We were both in Havana on December 17th, 2014, when this surprise announcement of a change in U.S. policy was made. I was so stunned to be there that I had my picture taken in front of the television set. So as proof that I was there on that day. The Cubans refer to this day as 17D. It sounds like an apartment number, but it's actually now this historical moniker of the day that the history of our relations changed. And they are changing. And perhaps as soon as this week, perhaps as soon as tomorrow or the next day, if John Kerry's broken leg doesn't interrupt the plan, there's going to be an announcement that the United States and Cuba, after decades and decades, 54 years almost of broken relations, are going to restore official diplomatic ties. And the issue, of course, is how we got to this point and how Obama did this. He started down, he made a call on December 16th to Raul Castro to kind of plot out what the final details were going to be for the next day. This is the first phone call that had been made, the first conversation between a U.S. president and a Cuban president. Since then, they have spoken on the phone again, and they've also actually met face-to-face in Panama at the Summit of the Americas in April. Now, we knew that someday this moment would come. And 10 years ago, we decided that rather than continue to write about the well-known narrative of U.S.-Cuban relations, what Henry Kissinger called the perpetual hostility in U.S. policy towards the Castro regime, a history that included, of course, the infamous CIA assassination plots, the exploding seashells, the poisoned scuba diving suit, the poisoned cigars, the poisoned pills, the poisoned hypodermic needle in a ballpoint pen, sniper rifles, etc. A history that included the Bay of Pigs invasion, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis that almost ended in nuclear catastrophe for the world, and the trade embargo that has been going on for all these years. Instead of doing that history, we decided 10 years ago that we would do this history because it would be more relevant. The history of secret talks between the United States and Cuba. We wanted to know what that dialogue had been. We wanted to know when it had succeeded. We wanted to know when it had failed and why it had failed. And we thought that those lessons would eventually be important for a U.S. president such as Barack Obama when the moment came and international circumstances and domestic political circumstances were aligned in a way that a change in policy would be possible. Barack Obama succeeded where a number of his predecessors had failed. He was not the first president to try and actually have a dialogue and even try and normalize relations with Fidel Castro and Raul Castro. He was just the first president to actually fully succeed. He was preceded by John Kennedy, who is well known for having given the green light for the Bay of Pigs invasion, for having authorized Operation Mongoose, the CIA operations, for instituting the trade embargo, but not as well known for having started a secret dialogue with Fidel Castro that was going on right at the moment that Kennedy was assassinated. Obama was preceded by Jimmy Carter, by Henry Kissinger, to a somewhat lesser degree, Bill Clinton, all of whom engaged in serious talks with the Cubans. One of the things that we discovered in doing this research was that even though Fidel Castro is well known for his anti-American tirades, the waving finger and the denunciation of U.S. imperialism, behind the scenes, he reached out to almost every single president of the United States fairly early on in their presidencies to see if better relations were possible. This is a rather famous document, the first 2 pages of a memo to President Kennedy from his top deputy, Richard Goodwin, after having met with Che Guevara. The meeting took place 5 months after the Bay of Pigs invasion. And despite that flagrant attack on the Cuban state, a bald attempt to roll back the Cuban Revolution, overthrow Fidel Castro, and implement our own preferred leadership there, despite that attempt, Fidel reached out through Che Guevara and basically said, is it possible now that we could have better relations? Che Guevara famously thanked Richard Goodwin at this meeting in Montevideo, Uruguay, for the Bay of Pigs. He said, thank you for the Bay of Pigs. It transformed us from an aggrieved little country into an equal and helped us consolidate the revolution. And now that the revolution is strong and we are an equal, could we find a modus operandi, a modus vivendi between our 2 countries? After Kennedy died, Fidel Castro reached out to Lyndon Johnson. He sent a secret message using an ABC News correspondent, Lisa Howard, to Johnson, basically saying, did you know I was in talks with President Kennedy before he died? We would like to continue those talks. I understand that it is a political year, campaign year, 1964, that you might be running against a Barry Goldwater or a Richard Nixon. And if you have to say hostile things about Cuba, be my guest. Even if you have to attack Cuba for political reasons, as long as you tell me that you're doing it for political reasons, I'll understand. But we would like to continue the talks towards better relations. Please do not misconstrue my interest in better relations as weakness. The revolution is strong, and we believe that we can coexist with the United States of America. This, I always tell audiences that this is one of the most stunning documents that we found at the College Park archives, actually, which is a memo of a meeting with the representatives of Switzerland. Castro used the Swiss ambassador as an intermediary with the United States, and he reached out to Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was well known to Fidel Castro as a Castro hater. Fidel had met him in April of 1959. Needless to say, they hadn't gotten along very well at their meeting. We have a photograph of the 2 of them on the front page of the book, Shaking Hands. But behind the scenes, Fidel believed that Nixon was paternalistic and chauvinistic and imperialistic and all those things. And Nixon thought that Castro was naive about communism or a communist already. So they didn't get along, but yet only 11 days after Nixon's inauguration, Castro reached out using the Swiss as intermediaries. He even reached out to Ronald Reagan, who was known as the quintessential Cold Warrior. He sent message after message, and these messages were basically dismissed. Castro was dissed by the Reagan administration early on, but that's not for lack of trying. In the case of Carter, just shortly after Carter's inauguration, Fidel Castro sat down with, I believe it was Diane Sawyer from ABC News, gave an interview, and basically said on television, I think Carter's a good man. I think he's somebody we could work with. He used an open vehicle as opposed to a back channel at that point to send a message to the United States. And the other thing that we discovered in doing this history is that pretty much every president since Kennedy had, if not reached out to Fidel Castro, engaged in talks. with Fidel Castro and Raul Castro. The Kennedy administration in 1963, kind of resetting itself after the dangerous missile crisis, believed that, at least a few officials at the very top believed that a sweet approach, as this declassified document suggests, might be more effective than the covert nastiness that was then in vogue and being used by the Kennedy administration to overthrow and roll back the Cuban Revolution. And the idea was that we could find a common ground with Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. We could wean Cuba away from the Soviets and bring Cuba back into the embrace of the Western Hemisphere and the capitalist system. And that was the idea at the time. Kennedy used secret intermediaries to do this. He used one lawyer, James Donovan, and two journalists, Lisa Howard and a French journalist named Jean Daniel. Jean Daniel was actually with Fidel Castro, carrying a message from Kennedy, a message of peace, they both decided, suggesting that coexistence was possible when the news came in that John Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. It was very dramatic. The first thing Castro said was, they're going to say we did it, which was true. The first rumors were that Castro himself was somehow behind the assassination of President Kennedy. And then he said to Jean Daniel, there goes your mission of peace. There goes your mission of peace. And it was true. And it took another 10 years before a U.S. administration, in this case kind of pushed by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, decided that there could be a possibility of secret talks between the United States and Cuba. Kissinger, of course, also known as a hardliner, supporter of dictators, a realpolitik politician and foreign policy maker. He took a realpolitik approach to Cuba, and the issue of Cuba was a real problem. The rest of Latin America was opposed to U.S. policy. They were pushing up against, wanted to rescind the multilateral sanctions against Cuba, and all of Latin America was saying to Kissinger, look, we're going to reestablish political and economic ties with the Cubans. That will leave you as the odd man out in the hemisphere. And Kissinger took the opportunity to also use a back-channel emissary, a famous Democratic operative named Frank Mankiewicz, to send a secret handwritten note to Fidel Castro saying, we should talk. And in the first set of secret meetings there were, Kissinger put forth this extraordinary kind of aide-memoire, the piece that's there on your left, in which he had a very interesting tone, a tone somewhat similar to the tone that Barack Obama more recently used, which basically said, we have ideological differences, but that doesn't mean that we can't coexist. We have common mutual interests we could pursue, and if we can have détente with China, we can certainly have détente in the Caribbean. And there were 6 or 7 secret meetings that were held at the places like the cafeteria of LaGuardia Airport, in the private homes of Kissinger deputies such as Lawrence Eagleburger here in Washington, D.C., and at the swanky Pierre Hotel just off Central Park in New York, where the very first true secret negotiation between the United States and Cuba took place in July of 1975. It was a 3-hour meeting. We have the declassified memorandum of conversation, and it looked very promising. Fidel Castro decided, however, that his commitment to anti-colonialism and revolution in Latin America, in Africa, was at least a higher priority than normal relations with the United States. He ended up sending 36,000 Cuban troops to Angola in the fall of 1975, and of course this left Kissinger angry as could possibly be. We obtained for the book the declassified memorandum of conversation of his meetings in the Oval Office with Gerald Ford, in which he went in and told the President of the United States, I think we're going to have to clobber Cuba for its role in Africa. I think we're going to have to smash that pipsqueak. We might have to wait until after the 1976 elections to do so. And of course, in those elections, Gerald Ford lost, and Kissinger and Ford had no opportunity to smash Cuba, to clobber Cuba for its incursion into Africa. Now, finally, let me say that Jimmy Carter was the true predecessor of Barack Obama. Philosophically, strategically, Carter came into office believing that dialogue with hostile states was far preferable to aggression. He issued this extraordinary directive, and someday we'll get a similar directive, I believe, declassified from the National Archives that Barack Obama signed a year or so ago, ordering the same thing. Carter wanted his staff to normalize relations with Cuba. He wanted them to go through a step-by-step process. He authorized secret talks, and a whole series of secret meetings took place. At every meeting, they came back to the same issue. The United States had a quid pro quo. If you get out of Africa, we can normalize relations. And Fidel Castro's response was, do I come and tell you how to conduct your foreign policy? There seemed to be a law for the United States and another law for smaller countries like Cuba. And I might be naive, but I don't agree with that presumption that you can tell us how to conduct our foreign and domestic affairs and presume to then make that a prerequisite for lifting the embargo that should never have been imposed in the first place. Obama and Cuba basically had preconditions, and lucky for the circumstances of this extraordinary breakthrough, they were equal on both sides. The precondition to better relations was that both countries had prisoners that they wanted back. Cuba wanted these 3 Cuban spies back: Antonio Guerrero, Gerardo Hernandez, and Ramon Lavanino, 3 of the so-called Cuban Five, a team of spies that had been sent to the United States in the 1990s by Cuban intelligence, largely to spy on exile groups who had a history of violence against Cuba or financing violence against Cuba. And the United States wanted Alan Gross back. Alan Gross was a USAID subcontractor. He was arrested in December of 2009 on his 5th trip to Cuba for smuggling in and installing satellite communications equipment in several communities throughout Cuba in an effort to set up independent communications channels between potential dissident leaders in the future and the United States government. And in the end, the CIA wanted this young man at the bottom there, whose name is not on this slide. His name is Rolando Seraf Trujillo. And he became part of the equation of a trade. And once this prisoner exchange was agreed to, we had the breakthrough that led to the opening of relations. And that's where we are today. Great momentum. That's kind of the background of how we got here. And I'm turning it over to my colleague to share with you where we are now and what's happening at this very moment.
Well, let me begin by adding my thanks to the National Archives for having us here today. The Archives is an extraordinary national resource for historians and even political scientists like myself. One of the things that we discovered in looking at this long history is that a number of lessons can be drawn from it. And the last chapter of the book actually goes through 10 of those lessons. I'm not going to go through all 10. I want to summarize, though, very quickly some of the ones that really stand out for us and that continue to be relevant today. First, of course, is that talking with the Cuban government is not at all abnormal. Every president since Eisenhower had some kind of dialogue with Cuba. Peter has gone over the administrations that focused on normalizing relations, but every administration, including Republican administrations, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, both Bushes, had dialogue with Cuba about issues of mutual interest, about problems that couldn't be solved by the United States alone, and had to engage Cuba in order to reach some kind of solution. The other lesson is that agreements are, in fact, achievable. There have been over a dozen bilateral agreements between the United States and Cuba since the Eisenhower administration. And the Cubans have kept their side of the bargain. In other words, when the Cubans make an agreement, they have actually a good track record of living up to them. But this is what prevented normalization for so many years, the Cubans are simply not willing to negotiate the basic principles of their foreign policy or the basic principles of their domestic organization, political and economic. They regard those things as a matter of their national sovereignty, and they simply are off the table when it comes to negotiations. And every administration up until President Barack Obama had a precondition, or as Peter put it, a quid pro quo, that the Cubans had to make some kind of concessions on those fundamental issues if the United States was going to normalize relations. And from the Cuban point of view, giving up their whole foreign policy in order to normalize relations with the United States, giving up their socialist system in order to normalize relations with the United States, simply wasn't worth the trade. Finally, and most importantly, the Cubans insist always on being treated with respect, being treated as an equal partner, if you will. They're very sensitive after having spent half a century as a virtual protectorate of the United States from the Spanish-American War in 1898 until the Revolution in 1959. They are very sensitive to any kind of slight to their sovereignty or to their pride. And so the United States has not had a good record historically of being sensitive to that issue. But if you go back and read President Obama's December 17th statement, one of the things you'll see in it is how careful he is to treat Cuba as an equal partner in this negotiation and in this set of agreements. So the president came to office actually in 2009 saying that he thought the old policy of hostility towards Cuba had failed and that we needed to try something new. But for the first 6 years, there wasn't very much progress forward. Then, after 18 months of secret negotiations, came the December 17th announcement. And the president said in December 17th that the old policy hadn't worked. That was the principal rationale for changing it. As he said in the State of the Union message, this old policy was way past its expiration date. But that raises the question, of course, if the policy was such a failure for such a long time, why did it take 54 years in order to get around to changing it? And I think that we can see that there are a couple reasons for why this change happened now. First, the cost to our relations with the rest of Latin America of having this policy of hostility towards Cuba had been going up very dramatically over the last decade. In Latin America today, most of the governments are governments of the left or progressive governments of one sort or another. You have the more radical populist government of Venezuela and some of the other countries, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, but you also have fairly traditional social democratic governments in places like Brazil and in Chile and Uruguay, all of which thought that the policy of hostility towards Cuba was a holdover of the Cold War, a holdover of the bad old days when the United States presumed to tell Latin Americans how to organize their affairs. It was a symbolic issue for the whole rest of the region. And the president saw that very dramatically at the Cartagena Summit of the Americas in 2012, when the issue of Cuba hijacked the agenda and prevented him from being able to actually raise and make progress on the kind of issues that were important to the United States. The Latin American president said to him then, if Cuba is not invited to the next summit, we won't come. There won't be another summit. So that rising diplomatic cost of the policy of hostility, I think, was one motivation for the change. The other was a change in domestic politics here in the United States. The Cuban American community for many, many years had been an obstacle to changing policy in Cuba. The more conservative wing of it was politically powerful, and presidents were afraid to get on their wrong side. After all, Florida is a swing state in presidential elections, and Cuban Americans would vote based on a candidate's attitude towards Cuba. But the community's been changing. And every year, about 30 to 40,000 new Cuban immigrants come to the United States. Those who have come since the end of the Cold War come primarily for economic reasons rather than political reasons like the early exiles came for. They keep contact with their family on the island. They visit their family on the island. They send remittances. And so for them, a normal state-to-state relation between Cuba and the United States is a good thing, not a bad thing. And so as the community has evolved, these newer arrivals and Cuban Americans born in the United States have a much more moderate policy, or much more moderate policy preferences toward U.S.-Cuban relations. And you could finally see that in voting in 2008 when President Obama got 35% of the Cuban American vote, as much as any Democratic presidential candidate previously, and then in 2012 when he got half the Cuban American vote. And I think that change convinced the White House that Cuba was no longer the third rail of Florida politics. It was possible now to have a new policy towards Cuba without paying a huge domestic political price. On the Cuban side, Raul Castro assumed the presidency in 2006 and then in his own right in 2008, and he's undertaken a process that he calls the updating of the Cuban economy. It amounts to a fairly dramatic restructuring of the Cuban economy away from a kind of hyper-centralized model of the Soviet Union toward a more market socialism on the model of China and Vietnam. And for Cuba, in this process of economic revitalization and renewal, having a normal relationship with the United States makes a great deal of sense. The Cubans think that they need $2.5 billion in direct foreign investment to sustain the kind of growth rates that they're interested in. The United States is an obvious potential source for that investment. Tourism now is one of the pillars of the Cuban economy. The United States is the principal sender of tourists to the Caribbean. The Cubans have just built a huge modern port at the port of Mariel to handle large container ships coming through the new Panama Canal. The United States is an obvious dropping-off point for those goods coming from China. So just as Gorbachev wanted to end the Cold War in order to restructure the Soviet economy, Raul Castro wants to end the Cold War in the Caribbean in order to succeed in updating the Cuban economy. There are two sets of talks underway right now as we look forward. One, which we believe is really virtually over and virtually concluded, are talks to normalize diplomatic relations, to restore diplomatic relations that were ended in January of 1961. The two big issues on the Cuban side were getting off the terrorism list, which happened last Friday, and securing banking services in the United States, which has also been accomplished now. On the U.S. agenda was the freedom of U.S. diplomats to travel around the island. We don't know if that issue has been settled yet, but at the end of the last round of negotiations 2 weeks ago, both sides said that they'd made a lot of progress and were very close to an agreement and probably wouldn't need another formal round of negotiations in order to conclude it. So as Peter said, we're anticipating that very shortly, within the next week or so, there may be an announcement setting a date for the restoration of diplomatic relations. Whether Secretary Kerry will be able to go, as he originally had hoped, to Havana in order to open the embassy is now, I think, an open question. But the broader negotiations that are already beginning focus on the normalization of relations as a whole. That is to say, the removal of U.S. economic sanctions and the normalization of bilateral relations so that Cuba is treated in the same way that we treat other countries around the world. There are already several working groups of diplomats on both sides that are working their way through a number of issues. There's one on claims, because we have claims against Cuba for the property nationalized in 1959 and 1960. Cubans have counterclaims against us for the damage done by the CIA's secret war in the 1960s and the embargo over the last 50 years. There's a working group on law enforcement cooperation. There are some 70 U.S. fugitives that have taken refuge in Cuba, and this group is discussing reestablishing normal extradition procedures. There's a working group on civil aviation so that we can expand normal air traffic to the island. A working group on human trafficking. There is a robust industry of people who smuggle Cubans out of the island in exchange for $5,000, $10,000 in some cases, smuggle them either to the United States or to Mexico so they can make their way through Mexico to the United States. There's a working group on human rights in which the two sides have already held a meeting and exchanged their differing conceptions of human rights. And there are a number of other issues that are going to have to be engaged and resolved before we can have a fully normal relationship. The most important one, of course, is the U.S. economic embargo, which remains in place. And to remove the embargo requires an act or acts of Congress. It was written into law in 1996 by the Helms-Burton Act. The president has executive authority to make exceptions to it by licensing, but he can't remove it in its entirety. There's another piece of legislation passed in the year 2000 that prohibits tourists to travel to Cuba. So although travel to Cuba has loosened up considerably in the last couple of years, especially with the changes the president announced on December 17th, you still can't just go to Cuba and lie on the beach if you want to. It's one of the only countries in the world you can't do that as an American resident. So lifting the embargo, lifting the ban on tourism are going to require acts of Congress. It's probably not likely that the present Congress will lift the embargo. I think one is looking forward toward the next Congress as the more likely venue for that, particularly as the presidential election gears up and several of the Republican candidates, Senator Cruz, Senator Rubio, Jeb Bush, have all come out very strongly against the president's policy as they vie for the Cuban American Republican vote for the Florida primary. But reactions elsewhere have been very positive. Reaction in Latin America was universally positive and effusive. And we can already see that our relationship with the hemisphere is improving. We saw that at the Panama summit just this past April as a result of this change in policy. The Pope gave the policy his blessing, coming out in favor of it after having himself played a very important role in bringing the two sides together. Public opinion here in the United States has been overwhelmingly favorable. 5 or 6 national polls have been done since December 17th, and they show consistently 60% or more of the general public in favor of this change in policy. And even the Cuban American community, in a 2015 poll by Ben Dixon and Amandi, showed 53% of Cuban Americans in South Florida in favor of this new direction. Now, there's many issues that remain to be negotiated. They will take years, unquestionably, to work all of them through so that we can say that the relationship is completely a normal one. But the obstacles that still lay ahead shouldn't detract from the fact that President Obama has really made an historic decision. He's reversed the policy that's been in place for 54 years, and he has charted a new course, moving away from the policy of hostility and diplomatic isolation and regime change that so many of his predecessors pursued in vain, and move toward a policy of engagement and coexistence with Cuba. And hopefully this new policy will lead not only to reconciliation between the two countries, but to a brighter future for Cuba as well. Thank you all for coming today, and we're happy now to answer questions for you. Yes, sir.
Go to the microphones if we don't mind.
So we have, to the microphones, yes. Yes, if you have a question, please go to the microphone so that the people on YouTube can hear your question.
I just want to thank both of you for your presentation. My name is Paul Walkerbarth. My question is, I'd like to hear a little bit more about President Obama's meeting with the Pope. I've heard from secondary sources that during the meeting, they spent a lot of time on Cuba, and I'm still trying to put together this process. I understand perhaps as an outcome of that meeting, there was a letter which was delivered in Cuba by the Archbishop of Havana. I don't know who delivered the letter to President Obama. I'm interested in knowing how that was, how the language was worked out. My own take on it is that I think generally in policy, at the heart, President Obama really is a populist in the sense he wants to serve what benefits people, and I think that the argument that the Cuban people would benefit may have been persuasive. Anything you can offer on that, I would appreciate.
It's a wonderful question, and we should just say that we spent a lot of time working on this very issue to add a new epilogue to the paperback edition of the book that's coming out in the fall. President Obama did meet with the Pope in late March of last year. There were a number of pressure points on the Pope to raise the issue of Cuba. A number of cardinals had contacted him, suggesting it would be a good idea. And President Obama himself came already convinced that it would be a good idea for the Pope to be an actor of some sort, to give his blessing, and perhaps the Vatican as a facility for the ongoing talks secretly that were in place at that moment with the Cubans. And the Pope did follow up in a number of ways, including sending very personal letters to both Raul Castro and to President Obama later in the summer of last year, and then actually hosting a meeting at the Vatican in late October of last year, which kind of sealed the deal, provided the papal blessing, if you will, for this.
And it was, in fact, the Archbishop. He's now no longer Archbishop Jaime Ortega, but he remains a cardinal who delivered the Pope's letters both to President Raul Castro and in a very sort of low-key and quiet, almost back-channel, secretive kind of way, delivered the Pope's letter to President Obama as well.
You can read the full story in the next edition of the book, but more questions?
Yes.
Yeah. These questions may be somewhat problematical, but I think they need to be asked. It seems to me that if, for example, and this is historical revisionism, so that makes it problematical. But if, for example, Gore had won the election in 2000, that we would not be, basically the Cuban American relations, I think, would have long been established. Maybe not during his first term in office, but during his second term, I think it would have been done. Because there were movements, the movements you all talking about, the change in the Cuban community was really, if you go back to the Dialogueros in the late 70s, majority of the Cuban population was kind of in favor of that, although there was still strong resistance. But an even more important question is, it seems to me, if you just take a look at what the Washington Post has been reporting the last few weeks about Cuba, that, in my discussions with, for example, Afro-Cubans at this point in time, there's tremendous worries about where this is headed. That if Cuba, I'm from a different part of the Caribbean. I'm from the French Dutch Caribbean. I'm from a small island by the name of St. Martin. But if you look at the U.S. relationships with the Caribbean, to put it very, 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 very nicely, they are highly problematical for the majority of the Caribbean people. For example, from tourism or from business, they do not benefit. If anything, they are plundered by it. I mean, look at the problems in Cuba at this point. I mean, in Puerto Rico at this point in time. I think very much Cuba should be very, very scared about what is coming its way. There seems to be a lot of optimism that this relationship is going to be a productive relationship. For me, this relationship is, as long as the United States does not change its policy, outlook towards the Caribbean and Latin America, which is basically, as I think you summed it up, we are demanding you follow. If you don't follow, there are going to be consequences. Cuba's tried to resist this. The problem is, if this system starts to collapse under the developing relationship, the socioeconomic relationships, we can see a lot of chaos happening in Cuba. So building on what you guys say, wouldn't you believe that to make this relationship work, that America would really have to fundamentally change its way in which it would engage with Cuba? In essence, to leave Cuba and to give Cuba a chance to really reform itself internally in a much more democratic and accountable fashion. If that's not done and changes are enforced from out, for me, this is 30, 40, 50 years before another Cuban revolution takes place.
So let me say something about Al Gore first, and then try to answer this much more difficult question. I think there's no doubt Al Gore would not have pursued the deeply hostile policy towards Cuba that George W. Bush pursued. But although the Cuban American community was already changing, and you could see it in opinion polls, the newer arrivals were not voting yet. They were not naturalized citizens yet. And those that were, the more recent arrivals, many of them registered to vote. And those that were had a much lower turnout rate than the old guard people who came in the 1960s and the 1970s. So I think it really did actually take additional time in order for the politics, the electoral politics of the community, as opposed to the attitudes of the community, to really change. I think the Cuban government is very aware of the risks that are entailed by an improvement in the relationship with the United States. All direct foreign investment projects, from wherever they come to Cuba, have to be approved at very high levels of the government. So the government is trying to channel direct foreign investment into its development priorities rather than just, anything goes. But having said that, I think that the Cuban economy, in the direction that it's moving today, really is dependent upon reinsertion into the global economy, a global economy in which the United States is dominant. And so having a normal economic relationship with the United States, while it may pose some risks of dependency for Cuba, the Cubans are aware of that. They're trying to diversify their international economic relations, but at the same time, they really do need to have access to the kind of foreign investment that can come from the United States, the tourists that can come from the United States, the trade that can be done between Cuba and the United States.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I was in Cuba a week ago with a group of a rather large group of people, liberal travelers. One of them made the point that they all wanted to see Cuba before we destroy it, and I think that a lot of that attitude is based on an assumption that there's something overwhelming by the Walmarts and the McDonald's and the Monsantos of the world, and the Cuban government will be suddenly transformed into a non-actor in this process, and that's history suggests that won't be the case. That Cuba will be different from Puerto Rico and the other smaller Caribbean islands, and that the Cubans understand what their goals are and what their interests are, and we can no more tell them which U.S. companies to let in or not let in than we could tell them, Carter or Nixon, what their foreign policy or domestic system of governance should be.
Mike?
Yes, my name is Mike Kopetsky. I'm a former congressman from Oregon and had the pleasure of being with you December 17th at a conference there in Cuba when this happened. But fortunately, you had written the book and I had read it before I got there, because it's just an amazing history that I think people across the United States and our policy readers, makers need to read, and because it shows what we've done and what the Cubans have done, and you've brilliantly pointed out that there's a way forward together. I did some comparisons with the China-U.S. relationship 25 years ago and made some comparisons with Cuba-U.S. relationships today. One of the things that I was struck by in your work is just how important the president is and how policies changed, even with people that wanted a relationship. In the end, things went awry. And we saw that maybe a little bit with China, but our leaders, whether they're Democrats or Republicans in the White House, said, we want to engage China and we want them to engage the world. And for pretty much our China policy was bipartisan. We seem to be at a turning point in this election. And I'm looking for your thoughts, your comments. Yes, Florida is important, but now is the Cuba question more nationalized, so it's not just Florida that's dictating policy. They have taken steps economically in terms of their economic system, as you've pointed out, which was significant for China to do as well. And whether you think there's no going back once you go down this small business world and larger business world that Cuba has gone. How important the race, how important the change of the economic system or the beginning of change? What's going to happen?
I do think that the economic updating of the Cuban economy really is authentic. I think it's deep, potentially. I think it's at a very early stage. I mean, some people who are skeptical say, well, they haven't really changed all that much yet. They've allowed some private businesses, but that's not much. But the Chinese reforms were modest at an early stage as well. And these are authoritarian governments testing out economic change to see what the political consequences will be before they take another step forward. And so, as Raul Castro himself has said, we're going to move forward without cease, but without haste. So I think the changes are, in fact, irreversible. On the U.S. side, there is a growing constituency, I think, for getting rid of the embargo and changing the travel ban, getting rid of the travel ban. Businesses now are a lot more interested in lobbying around this issue than they were 5 years ago, when they thought the president wasn't going to change the policy, so lobbying was beating your head against the wall. Now that the president is behind change, businesses are being more aggressive. And finally, you have, although the Republicans right now have a narrative that President Obama is weak on foreign policy and appeasing our enemies, which means they're not likely to do anything as a party that will make his Cuba policy a success, there are a lot of Republicans who are sensitive to business interests and would like to see businesses be able to get into Cuba. There are a lot of libertarian Republicans who don't like the idea of the government telling you where you can and can't travel as an individual. So I think if in the next administration, if there's a Democratic president, and if the Senate were to go back to Democratic hands, which is very possible because the Republicans have many, many, many more seats up for re-election than the Democrats do, then I think there's a real opportunity to move in the Congress to get rid of these legal vestiges of the old policy.
Let me just say that earlier in my talk, I showed you a slide of some of the intermediaries that John Kennedy was using, and he used one lawyer named James Donovan. And Donovan was the first negotiator to really win Fidel Castro's trust. He negotiated the release of the Bay of Pigs prisoners, and then he went back in the spring of '63 and started negotiating the release of a number of U.S. prisoners who'd been imprisoned after the revolution for a variety of kind of efforts to sabotage the revolution, including 3 bona fide CIA guys. And it was when they agreed to release those prisoners in a kind of a prisoner exchange early on in 63, Castro said to Donovan, you know, maybe we could build on this to change our relationship. What would it take, you know, after the Bay of Pigs and the missile crisis, what would it take for the United States and Cuba to actually change our relationship? And this was Fidel Castro in April of 1963 asking this question that only now has been answered. But at the time, Donovan said to him, Mr. Premier, do you know how porcupines make love? And Castro had to consult his interpreter. And then he said, no, I don't. And Donovan said, very carefully. And that is how you in the United States will go about trying to get back to normal relations. Well, that conversation took place in 1963, and we're now in 2015. And kind of operationally, it has been very carefully. These talks and feelers and gestures and negotiations and dialogues and attempts at agreements until now. But now, on the U.S. side, it's not very carefully. Obama, as Bill has just pointed out, really has an agenda to push this as far forward, as fast as possible, to consolidate these changes in policies and build an irreversible constituency for them. People who want to travel to Cuba, corporations that want to invest in Cuba, Cuban Americans who want to return to the island and rebuild as the economy is changing. And so we're on a fast track. If anything, it's the Cubans who are on the cautious side because they have the weight of history and the weight of the shadow of the kind of previous efforts of the United States of America to overthrow the Castro regime to consider. But I think at least until the end of the Obama administration, you're going to see step by step. John Kerry, even with a cast on his leg, may well go to Cuba relatively soon. The Pope is going to Cuba in September. President Obama says he wants to go to Cuba. The White House released a statement just last week saying that the president would relish the opportunity to go to Cuba. He wants to do what Nixon did in China and end the Cold War in the Caribbean once and for all, and have that as part of his legacy. So you're going to watch this going forward with some degree of momentum, I think, in the months to come.
I was lucky enough to be on a long-planned trip to Cuba in early January, so barely 3 weeks after 17D, and it was extraordinary to be there then. One of the questions or issues that came up a lot was what happens after Raúl. You've talked a lot about the U.S. side of this, but from the Cuban side, do you have any comment to make about what happens after Raúl?
So Raúl, one of the innovations that Raúl Castro has put in place in Cuba is term limits, if you can believe it. And so no senior official can serve more than 2 5-year terms, and Raúl's second 5-year term as president ends in 2018, and he has said that he will step down at that point. And so will the rest of los históricos, the historic generation that made the revolution in the first place. So it's going to be a younger generation taking over now. I mean, they've already started, but decisively by 2018. I think, though, that the Cuban leadership understands that the current direction in terms of the economy is essential to create a sustainable economic system in Cuba. Now, there is resistance. There's resistance in parts of the government bureaucracy and parts of the party bureaucracy to making these changes because, in every set of changes there are winners and losers, and some people who may end up feeling they're going to be losers are resistant to these changes. So, it's a challenge, I think, for the Cuban government in 2018 for Raúl to have made enough progress on his economic reform program so that it is clearly showing successful results, so that it becomes politically impossible for his successors to reverse it. I think in terms of the relationship with the United States, I don't see the Cubans having any interest in going back to the old way of doing things. For really almost since the end of the Cold War, it's been in Cuba's interest to have a more normal relationship with the United States. And they have sort of consistently offered that and pushed for that. And it's been the United States since the end of the Cold War that's been the more reluctant partner in this. And so, I do think it's possible, as Peter was suggesting just a minute ago, that even a Republican president in the United States might have a hard time completely undoing what President Obama has done. He would have the legal authority to do it, but I don't know that he would have the political conditions that would allow it if, in fact, this policy shows results, positive results, over the course of the next 2 years. Well, thank you all very much for coming.